You want to know what it actually feels like to stand between 20 trained killers and the one person they came for. I can tell you. Not because I read about it, not because someone described it to me later, because I was the one standing there. I was the one who turned the lock, heard the click, and thought, okay, this is it. This is the moment where you find out what you're actually made of. My name is Darian Holt. I was 31 years old when it happened. Former Marine, 2 tour in the outer belt conflict zones, 1 screwed up shoulder that never quite healed right, and a job that most people in my field considered either the best assignment of a lifetime or a complete dead end, depending on who you asked. I was personal bodyguard to Princess Tsarevna of the Velthiri sovereignty. Most humans hadn't heard of the Velthiri until about 8 years before this. The sovereignty showed up the way most things in space do, without warning, on a Tuesday, while everyone was trying to do other things. A fleet of vessels that made every human-built ship look like a child's bath toy. Tall figures with 4-jointed limbs, skin that shifted color depending on mood, the way our faces shift expression, and eyes that were completely, utterly silver. Not pale blue, not gray, silver, like mirrors. And when they looked at you, you could see yourself reflected back, and it was unsettling in a way that took a long time to get used to. The Velthiri weren't hostile. That was the thing that confused everyone at first. The initial contact protocols that every government and military body on Earth had been theorizing about for decades, all of it went sideways because the Velthiri representatives just came down and started asking if they could talk, politely, like they'd knocked on a neighbor's door. It turned out we were their neighbors, had been for a while actually. They'd known about us for roughly 200 years and had been watching, which should have been creepy but which the Velthiri High Council explained was standard practice before any first contact. They didn't want to show up while we were still figuring out things like basic sanitation and continental warfare. Fair enough, honestly. By the time of the night I'm describing, 8 years of careful diplomatic relationship building had produced a fragile but real alliance. Trade agreements, cultural exchange programs, a dozen joint research stations out past the outer planets, and a diplomatic goodwill tour, the first of its kind, during which Princess Tsarevna, youngest daughter of the sovereignty's High Sovereign, would visit 3 major human cities over 6 weeks. She was young, 23 in Velthiri years, which translated to roughly equivalent to 19 in human developmental terms. She was curious, quick, and had a habit of asking questions that seemed simple until you tried to answer them and realized they weren't simple at all. She was also, according to 3 separate intelligence briefings that I'd been given before taking the job, the target of multiple factions who desperately wanted the alliance between humanity and the Velthiri to fail. So I took the job seriously. I took it more seriously than anything I'd ever done. Let me tell you about the Solistara Grand Hotel, because you need to understand the space before you understand what happened in it. The Solistara was built in 2041, after the contact year, specifically to accommodate non-human diplomatic guests. It was located in New Geneva, which wasn't actually Geneva, but a purpose-built diplomatic city on the Swiss plateau that had been developed over about 15 years as a neutral hub for Earth's growing network of off-world relations. The buildings were designed with wider corridors, adjustable atmospheric systems, and ambient lighting that could shift toward the ultraviolet spectrum where certain species saw more comfortably. The hotel itself was 42 floors. It had an external shell of smart glass panels that responded to atmospheric changes and could modulate temperature within each individual room independently. The lobby was the size of an aircraft hangar. The elevators were large enough to fit a small bus. And the security was, at least on paper, formidable. I say on paper because I'd done a full walkthrough of the premises the day we arrived, and I had my concerns. The guest corridors were long and straight. Classic design problem, too many blind angles once you were moving, very little cover if something went wrong. The service entrance to the 31st floor, where the princess's suite was located, opened onto a stairwell that had only one camera coverage point, and that camera had a 17-degree blind spot on its left side that I'd clocked during the walkthrough. I flagged it. The hotel's security chief, a polite man named Armand Voss, who had been doing corporate security his entire career and had never once in his professional life contemplated the possibility that 20 trained assassins might show up, smiled, and told me they'd look into it. I asked for the camera to be repositioned by morning. It wasn't. I noted that in my log. Then I went back to my room, which was adjacent to the princess's suite, connected by an internal door that could only be opened with a biometric key that only I carried, and I tried to sleep. I didn't sleep much. Not because I was afraid exactly, more because I had a feeling. I've had the feeling before, in the outer belt before the Korova station ambush, in the Mariana Theater the night before the supply convoy hit that first electromagnetic trap. The feeling isn't panic. It's more like everything in your body going very quiet and very alert at the same time, like some deep part of your nervous system has picked up a frequency that your conscious mind hasn't registered yet. My nervous system was running hot that night. By 3 in the morning I was up, dressed, and doing a perimeter check of the corridor outside the princess's suite. It was a long hallway, deep burgundy carpeting that swallowed sound, low warm lighting at knee height along the baseboards. The kind of corridor that felt expensive and hushed and designed specifically to make you feel safe. I did not feel safe. There were 2 other members of the joint security detail that night, one Velthiri guard named Kelva, who stood roughly 7 feet tall and had the kind of stillness that only very trained or very dangerous beings possess, and one human officer named Tors from the Diplomatic Security Division. Tors was positioned at the main elevator bank at the end of the corridor. Kelva was inside the suite with the princess. I walked the corridor 3 times. Then I went to the end of the hall, looked at the stairwell door, and noticed something that put ice in my chest. The camera above the stairwell door was dark. Not cycling, not in power save mode, dark. The small indicator light that should have been red was off completely. Someone had killed that camera. I had my earpiece in. I touched it and opened the channel to the hotel's security desk. "This is Holt on 31. Your stairwell camera by Suite C is down. What's the situation?" Silence for 4 seconds. Then, "Checking now, Mr. Holt. Could be a power fluctuation. We've had some issues with the West Wing panel." "How long has it been down?" More silence, longer this time. "Sir, It's showing it went offline approximately 40 minutes ago." 40 minutes. I looked at the stairwell door. It was a heavy fire door, reinforced, with an electromagnetic lock that required a keycard to open from the stairwell side. Standard configuration. The kind of door that was designed to make you feel like the stairwell was inaccessible. I put my hand on the door. I listened. And I heard it. Very faint, very controlled, but I heard it. Movement. The specific quality of movement that you learn to recognize when you've spent enough time in situations where people are trying not to be heard. Not the random shuffling of someone using the stairs at 3 in the morning. Coordinated, multiple bodies, moving slowly. I had about 12 seconds to make a decision. I touched my earpiece again. "Tors, get off the elevator bank right now and move to a defensive position. Do it quietly and do not ask me why." Then I moved to the stairwell door, pulled it open about 3 inches and looked through. There were people in that stairwell. A lot of people. Moving up floor by floor in almost complete silence, wearing dark compression gear, carrying equipment that I recognized, pulse disruptors, which were a technology that had only become available through reverse engineering of Velthiri defensive tools. Lightweight, effective, legal in about 4 jurisdictions. You didn't buy that equipment for recreational use. I counted 8 visible from my angle. But the stairwell descended below my sightline, and based on the amount of movement I was hearing, there were more below. A lot more. I closed the door, very quietly, heard the lock click back into place. Then I turned around and did something that I have never, in all the years I've been telling this story, been able to fully explain in rational terms. I didn't run to get help. I didn't call for the full building lockdown. I went to the suite door, opened it with my biometric key, stepped inside and went straight to Princess Sarevha's room. She was awake. She was sitting cross-legged on the bed, which was adjusted to the firmer configuration she preferred, and she was reading something on a thin, luminescent tablet. Her skin was a deep, calm blue, the Velthiri resting color. When she saw me, her skin shifted, a ripple of amber, which I'd learned meant alertness, like a raised eyebrow in human body language. "Darian," she said. My name in her mouth always had that slight harmonic quality, like two voices slightly offset from each other. "You have the face you make when you are calculating something difficult." "Your Highness," I said, "there are people in the stairwell, multiple, armed with pulse tech. I believe they're coming for this floor." She was very still for a moment. Then she set down the tablet with complete composure, stood, and looked at Kelva, who had moved to my side already with the speed that large Velthiri guards could move when they chose to. "How many?" she asked me. "More than 8 visible. Possibly significantly more." She processed that for exactly 1 second. "What is your recommendation?" I told her what I was going to do. Her silver eyes reflected me back at myself. For a long moment she looked at that reflection at me, at my face, and then she nodded once. "Be careful, Darian Holt," she said. I went back to the corridor. I called Tors again. "Get the princess secured in the interior bathroom. Take Kelva. Lock the inner suite door and do not open it until you hear the all-clear code. You know the code." "What are you doing?" Tors said, and I could hear in his voice that he already knew at least partly. "I'm going to the stairwell door," I said. "Hold. Get her secured, Tors, right now." Then I went to the stairwell door. And I locked it from the outside. The stairwell door locked from the inside automatically, but it could also be deadbolted manually from the corridor side. I didn't know if these people had a key for the electronic lock, but the manual deadbolt was a different system entirely, a physical bolt that had nothing to do with the electronic keycard reader. The kind of redundancy that most people never thought about. I thought about it. I slid that bolt home. Then I positioned myself directly in front of the door, with my back to the corridor leading to the suite, and I waited. The first sign that they'd reached the 31st floor was the sound of the electronic lock being overridden. They had a bypass unit, which meant they'd planned for the keycard reader. They hadn't planned for a physical deadbolt they couldn't see from inside the stairwell. The door shuddered once in its frame, heavy impact from the other side. Then again, they were hitting it not with panic, with controlled, deliberate force, testing the resistance, recalibrating. I stood there and let them do it. Here's what I want to tell you about those seconds, about that specific stretch of time between knowing what's coming and having it arrive. People always assume that when you've made a decision, when you've committed yourself to something, the fear goes away. It doesn't. The fear is still completely there. What changes is that it stops being in charge. It becomes background noise instead of the main signal. You're aware of it the way you're aware of traffic noise when you're trying to concentrate. It's there. It's real. You're not ignoring it, but it's not running the show anymore. My shoulder was aching. It always ached when I was tense. The old injury deep in the joint where the reconstruction had never quite matched the original. I noted it the way you note a familiar sound. Old friend. Bad timing. I had what I'd come with. My sidearm, a Kovac 9 which fired kinetic rounds and could also switch to a tight beam electromagnetic pulse. My secondary, a compact version of the same, a belt of non-lethal canisters, concussion, smoke, and one electromagnetic disruptor that I'd been carrying as a precaution since the second day of this tour. A combat knife. Body armor that was rated for standard pulse damage, but would not hold up indefinitely against the kind of concentrated fire 20 armed targets could put out. Tor's voice came through my earpiece. She's secured, inner suite locked. Kelva is with her. Holt, I've called the building emergency line and the diplomatic security central node. Response teams are mobilizing. ETA. How long? I said. A pause, 14 minutes minimum, probably closer to 20. 20 minutes. The door shuddered again. The frame around the deadbolt was starting to show stress, micro deformations in the metal, the kind you could hear if you knew what to listen for. I had maybe 90 seconds before they came through. I took a breath. And then I did what my instructors at Basic had called the most important thing any soldier can do when the odds are fundamentally stupid. I stopped thinking about the overall math and started thinking about the next 3 seconds. The next 3 seconds were, they come through the door, they will expect the corridor to be empty or lightly defended. They will not expect to be engaged at immediate close quarters by a single opponent. Surprise isn't just a tactical advantage, it's an emotional one. It creates hesitation. Hesitation creates time. Time is the only resource that mattered in the next 20 minutes. The door blew. Not all at once. The deadbolt held longer than I expected, which was good. But the frame finally gave. A sharp wrenching sound as the bolt tore through the housing, and the door swung hard into the corridor. The first 2 figures came through fast and low, the way trained operators move when they're breaching a space, crouched, weapons up, scanning. They were expecting corridor. They got me, 2 feet from the door, already in motion. I took the first one by the weapon arm, used his own forward momentum to drive the muzzle of his pulse disruptor into the door frame, and heard the device shatter on impact. My elbow caught his jaw on the follow-through. He went down. The second one was a half-second behind, which is a lifetime in close quarters. I stepped inside his weapon angle. If you're inside the muzzle radius, the weapon is worse than useless for the person holding it, grabbed his collar and drove him into the wall of the corridor. Hard. The plaster cracked. He didn't get up immediately. 2 down. The next 3 came through together, which was smarter. But they came through a doorway that was only wide enough for 2 at a time, which meant the third had to wait his turn, and that half-second gap was again the thing that mattered. I'd already moved. I wasn't where they were aiming when they cleared the door. I was at their flank, having stepped back along the corridor wall, and I hit the first canister, smoke, thick and fast dispersing, filling that section of corridor in about 2 seconds. In the smoke, I had the advantage. Not because I couldn't see much better than they could in it, but because I knew exactly where the walls were, exactly how wide the corridor was, exactly where the door was behind me and the suite door was in front of me. And they didn't. They'd breached into unknown space. I moved by memory and touch, and the specific sounds of people trying to navigate through a space they couldn't see, and I was not gentle about it. I won't catalog every exchange, partly because some of it is still a bit blurred in my memory, the way intense physical situations always are. Your brain doesn't record them cleanly the way a camera does. It records them in fragments, high-contrast moments with gaps in between. What I remember clearly. The moment the smoke started to thin, and I realized there were still 8 or 9 of them in the corridor, and they had reorganized and were spreading out, taking positions along the walls, no longer trying to rush through. They'd adapted, which told me 2 things. First, these weren't amateurs. Second, and this is the thing that ran cold through me, they were settling in. They were preparing for a sustained effort. They weren't going anywhere. One of them called out, Not in any human language. A sequence of tonal sounds that I recognized as Velthiri phrasing, not the standard dialect I'd learned to navigate, but something older, something with a different cadence. Military dialect, I realized. Old Velthiri military code. They weren't all human. There were Velthiri among them. That was the moment I understood the full shape of what this was. This wasn't a random faction attack. This was coordinated across species lines. There were humans and Velthiri both in that stairwell, both moving toward that suite, both invested in the same objective. Someone had built a coalition of enemies. And they'd built it well enough to buy themselves 20 trained operatives and get them all to the 31st floor of a guarded hotel in the middle of the night. I hit the second canister, electromagnetic disruptor. It wasn't designed as a weapon. It was designed to disable electronics in a 10-meter radius. The pulse disruptors they were carrying were electronics. Every single one in the blast radius went dead simultaneously, and I heard the sounds of people suddenly realizing their primary weapons were paperweights. 4 seconds of confusion. I used all 4. I took 2 more down in those seconds, hard takedowns, the kind that end the fight quickly. A third got my shoulder, the bad shoulder of course, because of course, with an impact that sent white light across my vision and dropped me to one knee. I got back up. It's interesting, the mechanics of getting back up when every rational signal in your body is suggesting you should stay down. There's no dramatic internal monologue about it. There's no inspiring thought. You just get up, because the alternative is that the people behind you get through to the suite. That's the whole calculation. I got up. By my rough count, with 7 or 8 down and at least 12 still functional, I was somewhere around the 8-minute mark since Tors had made the call. 12 more minutes. 12 minutes is nothing in ordinary life. It's a short podcast segment, a quick errand, the time it takes to make a decent cup of coffee. In a corridor with 12 trained operatives who want to get past you, 12 minutes is enormous. It is vast and detailed and full of individual moments that each require individual decisions. I'd retreated toward the suite end of the corridor. Not running. You don't run from people who have ranged weapons, even disabled ones, because some of them will still have non-electronic options. Running exposes your back and tells them you're in full retreat, and removes the psychological pressure of having someone standing between them and their objective. I walked backward, kept my face toward them, kept my weapon up. They were doing something interesting. The remaining operatives had split into 2 groups. 4 of them were working the unconscious bodies in the corridor, checking vitals, pulling the incapacitated out of the firing line. The other 8 had pushed past them and were advancing slowly, measured steps, keeping spacing between them. These were the more experienced ones. The first through the door are almost never the veterans. The veterans watch the breach, assess the resistance, and then move when they've got a clearer picture. The clear picture they had was a single human body standing in a corridor between them, and where they needed to go. I watched them watching me. In the subdued corridor lighting, some of which I'd shattered with thrown objects during the initial engagement, they were hard to read. 4 human silhouettes and 4 Velthiri, the latter significantly taller, moving with that particular quality of controlled grace that always reminded me of deep water. Smooth on the surface, enormous force underneath. One of them spoke. English this time, but with the slight tonal layering that indicated a Velthiri speaker. "Human bodyguard," the voice said. "Stand aside, our quarrel is with the princess only. You will not be harmed." I've heard variations of that sentence in multiple contexts over my life. Military zones, 2 separate hostage situations I've been involved in, a very confusing incident in the outer belt involving a disputed cargo claim. The sentence always means the same thing. It means the speaker is giving you one final opportunity to make their job easier. I said no. Just that. One word. And I could feel it land on them. The weight of a single syllable in a corridor full of people who'd expected something different. Compliance, negotiation, fear, the particular flexibility that people show when they've run the math and don't like the answer. I'd run the math, I just didn't accept the conclusion. The Velthiri who'd spoken tilted their heads slightly. Color shifted across their visible skin, a fast ripple from neutral gray to something darker, something that in Velthiri emotional language I'd been told indicated a complex combination of calculation and what could only be called reluctant respect. Then they came at me again. This phase was different from the first breach. They were organized now. They used the width of the corridor two abreast, using each other's positioning for cover, one pair suppressing while another pair advanced. Basic tactical geometry, but effective. I used the walls. Literally, I'd noted when I did my walkthrough that the wall panels in this section were decorative over a hollow space, and I'd filed that information away the way you file away anything you don't know if you'll need. I drove my shoulder into one panel. The bad shoulder screamed at me about this, and it gave, and I moved through the gap into the narrow service cavity behind it. They didn't expect that. I gave them 2 seconds to process it, and then I came back out through the next panel down, behind the advance pair, which put me between the second group and the first. Split their attention, disrupted the formation. I had maybe 30 seconds of that advantage before they realigned. I used 30 seconds. It went on like this. I want you to understand the texture of it. I want you to understand that it wasn't a clean fight. It wasn't choreographed. I took hits. My shoulder was increasingly problematic. The joint that had been reconstructed was now complaining loudly and consistently about the demands being placed on it. I had a split lip from somewhere around the 6-minute mark. My right knee had caught a glancing impact from a thrown piece of equipment that had compromised my movement enough to notice. But I was still in the corridor. That was the only thing that mattered. Whether I was comfortable or damaged or hurting didn't factor into the operational calculus. What factored in was my position, and my position was between 20 people and one suite door. At some point, I think around the 10-minute mark, though my time sense was warped, the Velthiri among the attackers stopped engaging directly and started doing something else. 2 of them had moved to the edges of the corridor and were working on something I couldn't immediately identify. Small devices, placed against the wall at intervals. I recognized them about 2 seconds before they activated. Neural resonance emitters, Velthiri tech. They interfered with organic nervous system function in the immediate area, not lethal at this power range, but they would produce a sustained disorientation effect that would progressively impair coordination, judgment, and pain response suppression. Basically, they were going to make it very hard for me to function. I went for the first emitter, knowing what it cost me in position. Moving away from the suite door to address the emitter meant the advance pair could push forward. It was a trade-off. I smashed the first emitter, got hit from behind for my trouble, a solid body impact that drove me into the wall. The second emitter was already active. And I felt it, like static in the back of my skull, not painful exactly, but destabilizing, like the floor was subtly uncertain, like the edges of my vision had gotten slightly less reliable. I took a breath, anchored myself. This is the thing about humans, and I don't say this to be dramatic. I say it because it's physiologically documented and the Velthiri knew it. And I'm told the operative who filed the after-action report on this incident noted it specifically. Humans have a redundancy in our nervous system that most species don't. When one set of sensory inputs gets disrupted, we can shift processing to compensate. It's not perfect, it's not elegant, but it's adaptive in a way that's specific to organisms that evolved in environments with inconsistent conditions. The neural emitter was calibrated for Velthiri nervous systems. It affected me, but not the way it was designed to affect someone. I kept moving. Tor's voice came through my earpiece. I'd lost the earpiece for a few minutes somewhere in the middle of it, but I'd pushed it back in, and he was doing a countdown. 11:40, he said. Holt response teams are on approach. 11:40. 11 minutes and 40 seconds since the call. I'd been in this corridor for 11 minutes and 40 seconds. It felt like much longer. It felt, in some ways, like it was the entirety of my adult life, compressed into a single length of deep burgundy carpet and low, warm lighting. 6 of the original attackers were down. 4 were incapacitated in varying degrees. That left 10 still functional. 10 against 1. I was not in good shape. The shoulder was significantly compromised at this point. There are certain arm movements I simply could not complete because the joint would not cooperate. I was running on my secondary weapon, having emptied the first in a combination of kinetic and EMP rounds. The knee was increasingly stiff. The neural emitter effect was producing a persistent buzz in my peripheral hearing that was annoying and slightly disorienting. But I was still in the corridor. And those 10 remaining operatives were doing something that told me more about the overall situation than anything else in the entire engagement. They were hesitating. Not from fear, exactly. These were trained people. They didn't hesitate from fear. They hesitated because of something more complicated, because the math of the situation had drifted from what they'd been told to expect, and trained operatives who are being paid to perform an operation need a certain degree of confidence that the operation is viable before they commit fully. They'd been told what? That there was a bodyguard, one human bodyguard, that he could be bypassed or removed quickly, that the suite beyond him contained their target. But 11 minutes into the operation they had 10 people down, one human still standing between them and the suite, and that human was not retreating, was not negotiating, and had, this is the part that I'm told specifically rattled the Velthiri among them, because it is apparently not a characteristic they readily expect from any species, was not visibly afraid. I was afraid. Let me be absolutely clear about that. I was afraid the whole time, but fear in my body expresses as focused intensity, not as the signs that the Velthiri emotional reading ability picks up. My skin doesn't change color. My pheromone output is not keyed to their sensory organs. To them, reading me through their native social perception, I was unreadable. And the unreadable, in a high-stakes tactical situation, is more unsettling than the obviously afraid. One of the human operatives called out, "Why are you still here?" It was almost philosophical, the way he said it, like he was genuinely puzzled. I took a second, which I could afford because they were still hesitating. Because I said I would be, I said. Which was not, in the moment, a particularly calculated statement. It was just the answer, the simplest version of what was true. But it landed. I could see it land. The Velthiri communicator, the tall one who'd made the earlier offer, shifted color again. That dark ripple, deeper this time, more complex. Later, when I had the engagement analyzed by a Velthiri cultural attaché, she told me that the color pattern the operative displayed in that moment was one of the most complex multi-layered emotional expressions she'd ever seen documented in field conditions. It combined calculation, reassessment, something close to what she called cosmological discomfort, which is apparently what Velthiri experience when a situation contradicts their fundamental assumptions about how the universe operates, and, she told me with some hesitation, something that in Velthiri emotional language is associated with reverence. Reverence for a damaged, limping human bodyguard standing in a hotel corridor. 4 more minutes. The 10 remaining operatives made one more organized advance. This one was different from the others. It was harder, more committed. They were trying to end it one way or another, and they brought everything they had left to that attempt. I'm not going to lie to you and tell you I held them cleanly. I didn't. They got me down at around the 13-minute mark. A coordinated press from 3 sides that finally used my compromised shoulder against me in a way I couldn't compensate for. They targeted it deliberately, used it as an anchor point, and I went down. On my knees. I looked at the suite door. It was maybe 4 meters behind me. I looked at the 10 people in the corridor ahead of me. I got back up. I have no rational explanation for that beyond the one I've already given. The alternative was that the people behind me got through to the suite, so I got up. And I think that was the moment, that specific moment of getting up, that broke something in the operational calculation of the remaining attackers, because 3 of the 10 pulled back, not all the way, but back, like they needed to reassess. And 4 minutes later, the response teams hit the floor from both the elevator bank and the secondary stairwell. The response teams were thorough and fast, and when they came through the elevator doors and processed the length of the corridor, there was a moment. I was told about this later by 3 of the officers who were there, where the entire response team stopped. 16 people. 12 response officers, 2 diplomatic security leads, and a pair of Veltheory security officers who'd been part of the broader protective detail for the tour. They stopped because of what they saw. One man, standing, in a corridor with 20 incapacitated, retreating, or otherwise non-functional attackers around him, blood on his face, one arm hanging at an angle that suggested the shoulder was badly compromised, one hand still holding a weapon that had been empty for the last 6 minutes. Standing, one of the Veltheory security officers, a senior officer named Vareth, who had 40 years of service in the Sovereignty's elite guard, reportedly made a sound that the human officers present couldn't identify. Later, through translation, they learned it was a vocalization that Veltheory make in the presence of something they're not sure they should have witnessed, something that falls outside their prepared categories. I don't know exactly what I looked like in that moment. I imagine it was not impressive by any conventional visual standard. I was a mess, but I was in the corridor, and the suite door behind me was closed. And from beyond that closed door, when the all-clear code was given and it was opened, Princess Serevha walked out into the corridor and looked at what had happened, and at me, and she was silent for a long moment. Then she said, in Veltheory, which I had enough of by then to understand the core of, "He stood." Just that. He stood. The investigation took 11 weeks. I was in a rehabilitation facility for 4 of those weeks. The shoulder required reconstruction again, and the knee needed a procedure, and there were various other things that needed attention that I'd been ignoring in the corridor. None of it was as bad as it might have been. What the investigation found. The 20 operatives were a coalition, 14 human, drawn from 3 different fringe groups who opposed the Veltheory alliance for various reasons ranging from political ideology to economic interests threatened by the trade agreements. 6 Veltheory, part of a traditionalist faction within the Sovereignty that opposed Serevha's family's policy of opening relations with humans, who they considered a species too young and too chaotic to be trusted. Both sides had the same goal: collapse the Goodwill Tour, eliminate the princess, and create a diplomatic crisis that would rupture the alliance before it became stable enough to survive a rupture. It was a sophisticated operation. It had been planned for months. The camera blackout, the bypass devices, the neural emitters, these were not improvised. Someone had invested significant resources and expertise. They had not, however, planned for the man they found standing in the corridor. Of the 20 operatives, 12 were arrested. 5 escaped the scene but were identified and apprehended within 72 hours. 3 escaped, 2 of whom were subsequently apprehended by Veltheory intelligence teams over the following weeks. One was never found. That one still bothers me. But that's not the part of this story that people remember. The part people remember is what happened about 6 weeks after the incident, when Princess Tsarevna gave a public address at the New Geneva Diplomatic Assembly. It was supposed to be a standard speech about the value of the alliance, the progress of the goodwill tour, the shared future of humanity, and the Valkyrie sovereignty. She gave that speech, but at the end of it she added something that wasn't in the official prepared remarks. She talked about the night on the 31st floor. She talked about what she had been told, afterward, by Kelva and Tors and the security officers who'd arrived on the scene. And she said something that was translated live and broadcast across about 100 networks. She said, "When they came for me, a human locked the door and stood between me and 20 trained killers. He did not calculate whether the odds permitted it. He did not wait to see if someone else would do it. He had told me he would be there, and so he was there. I have studied your history. I know that humans have a word for this that you use carefully because you know how easily it is made hollow. But I am not human, and so perhaps I can say it without the weight of overuse. What I saw in that corridor, in the aftermath, in the face of a man who should not have been standing but was courage. And I would like my people, and the galaxy that is watching this alliance form, to understand what it means that humanity contains this." It was a 14-second addition to a formal diplomatic address. It ran on every major news platform for weeks. It's in the standard curriculum in about 60 schools on Earth that I know of, and I'm told it's taught in Valkyrie educational institutions as well, though in a different context, as an example of what they call species-characteristic behavior under impossible conditions, which is their very careful way of saying something that I think, if you strip away the anthropological framing, amounts to the same thing she said. People ask me a lot of questions about that night. The one they ask most is some version of, "Why? Why didn't you fall back and wait for the response teams? Why didn't you get the princess out through another route instead of holding the corridor? Why, when they got you down, did you get back up?" I've given different versions of the answer over the years, and the versions have all been true as far as they went, about training, about the tactical reasoning behind holding a fixed point, about what happens when you let a breach team push past you into a suite with one exit. But the real answer is simpler and probably less satisfying. I told her I would be there. I told her, in the conversation we had after I described what was in the stairwell, that I was going to the corridor, and I was going to make sure nothing came through to her. And she looked at me with those silver eyes that showed me my own reflection, and she asked me to be careful, and I went. And the whole time I was in that corridor, every single moment of those 14 minutes, what I was aware of, underneath everything else, was that I had told her I would be there. So I was there. That's it, that's the whole engine of it. I've thought about this a lot in the years since, about whether it's remarkable or whether it's just what humans do or are supposed to do or used to do more reliably than we currently do. I think the honest answer is that it's both. It's not remarkable in the sense of being alien or supernatural. It's not some extraordinary quality that only certain people have. It's a decision. A sequence of decisions, each very small, each building on the one before. You decide to stand here, then you decide to get up, then you decide to get up again, then again. The Valkyrie cultural attaché I mentioned, the one who analyzed the color patterns from the security footage, her name was Yalith, and she became a friend over the years since, in the way that people who have talked seriously about the same event many times become friends. She told me once that what she found most interesting about the incident, from an anthropological perspective, was not the fighting. She said the fighting was impressive but not unique. There were species across the galaxy capable of impressive individual combat performance. What she found interesting was the getting up. Every time you fell, she said, there was a moment, we can see it in the footage, where you calculated the situation. You looked at it, and then you got up anyway. That is not what any other species in our documented contacts does when the mathematics say to stop. Most species are very honest about mathematics. Humans are the species that will look directly at an impossible number and say, "I don't accept that," and act accordingly. "Is that a compliment?" I asked her. She tilted her head the way Velthiri do when they're considering. "It is something more complicated than a compliment," she said. "It is a recognition. We knew you were a young species. We knew you were chaotic and unpredictable. What we did not know, what that night demonstrated, is that the chaos runs in more than one direction. You are chaotic in your destruction, but you are also chaotic in your determination, and we had not fully prepared for the second kind. I should tell you about her. Not the princess, the person. Because the story gets told as a bodyguard story, as a combat story, as a story about humans and what we're capable of. And all of that is real. But at the center of it is a 23-year-old person who sat cross-legged on a bed reading a tablet at 3 in the morning, who heard that there were 20 armed operatives in the stairwell, and whose first response was to listen to what I was going to do and then say, with complete composure, "Be careful." Sarevha was brilliant. Not in the distant, inaccessible way that the word sometimes implies, not in the way of someone whose brilliance puts them behind glass. In the way of someone for whom the world is perpetually and delightedly interesting, and who wants to understand everything about it. She asked me, in the first weeks of the assignment, about approximately 400 things. Why do humans shake hands with the right hand specifically? Why certain colors are associated with certain emotions in human cultures when the associations seem arbitrary? Why I kept notes on paper when digital recording was available? Why the hotel carpet was burgundy? Why the lights in the corridor were positioned at knee height? I answered every question as honestly as I could. Some of them I didn't know the answer to. She seemed equally interested in the answers and in the not knowing, the things your species does without understanding why it does them, she told me once, are very revealing. They are the behaviors that are old enough to have lost their explanation but not their persistence. She wanted to understand humans, not abstractly, not as a political project or a diplomatic objective, personally. She wanted to know what we were actually like, underneath the formal presentations and the prepared remarks and the official cultural exchanges. I think what she found surprised her. I think she found that we were smaller and louder and more confused than our formal presentation suggested, and that we were also, in certain moments, something else entirely, something that she didn't have a precise word for in her own language, and so she reached across the distance between our species and used ours. She used the word courage. After the engagement, when she was safe and the corridor was full of response teams and the investigation was beginning, she came out of the suite and she found me sitting on the floor with my back against the wall, because my knee had finally communicated clearly that it was done with the vertical option for a while. She sat down on the corridor floor next to me. Right there, in the middle of the response team mobilization, the forensics, the communication channels being established. She sat down on the expensive burgundy carpet and she looked at me and she didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "I would like to understand what you are." And I said, "That makes two of us." And she made a sound that I'd learned over the previous weeks was Velthiri laughter. Not loud, not human-shaped. A soft resonance like two notes agreeing with each other. "I think," she said, "that is perhaps the most honest thing you have told me." Document 9. What the galaxy learned that night. In the years since, there have been a lot of analyses. Academic papers, diplomatic briefings, military training curriculum content. One surprisingly good documentary that got the broad details right even if it got several specifics completely wrong. Most of them focus on the tactical elements. A few focus on the diplomatic aftermath. The Velthiri traditionalist faction that had participated in the assassination attempt lost significant standing within the sovereignty's internal political landscape. The exposure of their involvement in an operation specifically designed to harm the High Sovereign's daughter proved, as these things often do, more damaging to their cause than any policy argument could have been. The human fringe groups involved were similarly diminished. Some were dissolved, some fractured under the pressure of the investigation, some simply lost enough membership to cease being operationally relevant. The argument that the Velthiri alliance was dangerous to humanity is hard to make loudly when a human bodyguard just spent 14 minutes in a corridor proving it wrong. The alliance didn't just survive, it deepened. Not because of the speeches, though the speeches were given. Not because of the diplomatic machinery, though the machinery kept working. It deepened because of something more fundamental. Because a Velthiri princess had sat on a hotel corridor floor next to a damaged human bodyguard, and because that image had been caught on a restored security camera and released with the consent of both parties, and because, when people across both species saw it, something that lived below the level of politics and policy recognized itself. The willingness to sit with someone in their mess, to not require them to perform dignity for you, to simply be present next to them in the reality of what had just happened. Sarevha did that, naturally, without calculation. And maybe that's what the story is actually about when you get down to it. Not the fighting, not the odds. Not the remarkable and well-documented fact that a single human bodyguard held a hotel corridor against 20 trained assassins for 14 minutes until help arrived. Maybe it's about two people from different species, different stars, different physiologies and histories and ways of reading the world, sitting on the floor of a hallway together in the aftermath of something awful, and finding in each other something they hadn't expected. Something worth protecting. Something worth standing for. I still have the job. Different assignment now. I'm not field active in the same way. The shoulder made that impractical. I'm the senior protective coordination lead for the Velthiri diplomatic mission on Earth, which means I manage a team rather than working a corridor alone. It's good work, important work. Sarevha is High Sovereign's first representative now, a position that was created specifically to manage the human alliance, because the relationship has grown to the point where it needs dedicated senior leadership. She's based partly in New Geneva and partly on the sovereignty's primary diplomatic vessel in near-Earth orbit. We still talk, not as often as we used to because both of our jobs have expanded in ways that fill the calendar, but we talk. She asked me once, several years after that night, whether I thought what I'd done in the corridor was brave or stupid. I thought about it for a while, genuinely thought about it. Probably both, I said. But I've come to think that might be how most of the things worth doing actually work. She was quiet for a moment, then she did that two-note laughter sound. Yes, she said, I believe you may be right about that. The galaxy is a large and complicated place, full of species and histories, and competing interests and old wounds and new alliances, and 1,000 different ways of understanding what a life is worth, and what it means to stand for something. We're still figuring it out, all of us. But on a Tuesday night in a hotel corridor in New Geneva, with the carpet ruined and the lights broken and 20 trained killers on one side and one princess on the other, a man who probably should have run did the thing that the best humans have always done when the numbers are wrong. He stood. And the galaxy, slowly, imperfectly, argument by argument and gesture by gesture and moment by moment, watched. And took notes.